Look, we've been playing fantasy football for a long time, and eventually you just come to learn which strategies work, which strategies don't. We're going to share with you some of the things you may not know. These are 5 strategies that expert fantasy football players use that maybe you don't.
If you can't wait to start drafting fantasy football teams, you don't have to. Underdog Fantasy has drafts with entry fees as low as $4 and prize pools up to $15 million. And of course, their flagship Best Ball Mania 5, where someone will win over $1 million. Plus, if you sign up and use promo code ENDGAME, you'll get a special pick that you can use to potentially win 325 times your entry. And you're going to get up to $250 in bonus cash. Don't wait. Go join Underdog Fantasy now and use promo code ENDGAME to get your special pick and cash.
Let's start with number 1, probably the most common thing we see, especially in your home leagues. Look, the most popular players are the quarterbacks, right? They're the leaders, they're the ones who get the publicity, and they put up a lot of points, but you do not have to draft a quarterback in the first round or even that early at all. And the same thing with tight ends. Chris, what's your general strategy on how to approach QB and tight end? Because we're also not saying you don't have to get one of those top players at all.
Right. I mean, if you can get an elite QB or an elite tight end, by all means, you should do it. But you should do it when they fall to you at a value. So my general strategy is when I'm looking at the players on the board, like the players that are still available, if there's nobody there that I absolutely love that jumps out to me, but one of the elite QBs or maybe one of the elite tight ends are still on the board, then I'll go ahead and think about pulling the trigger on QB or tight end then. But by no means am I going to take a QB or a tight end when there are running backs or wide receivers that I still really love on the board. Because first of all, when you look at tight end, even the best tight ends, like even Sam Laporta last year, yes, he was great for a tight end, but when you compare him to wide receivers and running backs, he wasn't as good as the best running backs and wide receivers. It wasn't like what we saw from that one year from Travis Kelce, where he was as good as the best running backs and wide receivers. Usually the best tight end is kind of like a high-end flex when you look at their points per game. Now on quarterback, absolutely, they're going to outscore a lot of players, but the thing about quarterback is it's a deep position. And we saw this last year. All the rage last year was draft elite early QB, right? Everybody talking about draft elite early QB. And then what happens? You get guys like CJ Stroud, Brock Purdy, Baker Mayfield. I mean, these guys that were not even drafted in some leagues end up being better than the early elite QBs. So my general strategy is I'm not going to force an early QB or a tight end. If it happens organically because they drop in value in the draft, sure, I'll take the plunge, but I'm definitely not going to force it when I can just wait and get similar production later in the draft.
That's exactly right. We preach this all the time. It's always about value, and I feel like I've been saying this for several years. Let me get that quarterback who I can take in the mid to late rounds that can be a top 10 QB. You don't have to have the number 1 fantasy scoring QB or even the top 2 or 3 in order to win your league, right? Just need a guy who is one of the best, right? Top 10, that's good enough. Because while everyone else is taking a quarterback in the first couple of rounds, you're taking those elite receivers and running backs. Pat Mahomes, it's nice to have that on your team, right? It's a good feeling knowing you have one of the best quarterbacks. But what if I told you Jordan Love, Brock Purdy, Jared Goff, all of those guys finished with more fantasy points per game than Pat Mahomes last year? That's right. You do not have to draft a quarterback early. There's always great value. And there's a lot of reasons why you can get some discounts on players. In fact, that leads me to my next strategy. Strategy number 2, take advantage of those discounts on players who get that injury-prone label. Injuries happen, you can't predict it, but some guys kind of get a bad rap just because they've had more than one injury. So Chris, how do you decide if a guy is injury prone or not?
Well, my belief is that most players are not injury prone. I mean, sure, some guys, there are these few guys that just seem they can never get healthy, they can never stay on the field, but I don't want to say the nice thing about those guys because that's not a good way to put it, but the nice thing about those guys for fantasy is their careers usually don't last very long, and you really aren't drafting them after a few years because they're not really playing, they're not really getting playing time, and they're out of the league pretty quickly. But we've seen it in the past. Like the example I always use is Keenan Allen. If you were around when Keenan Allen first came into the league, he repeatedly, every year it seemed like he had a season-ending injury after season-ending injury. And I remember after 3 or 4 years, people were literally like, I am not touching Keenan Allen. He's always hurt. Then what happened? He went like 4 straight years or 5 straight years without missing a game and was an absolute stud. So if the player has the talent, if the upside is there, and they've just been, hit with injuries, I'm going to take a chance on that. Now, I will say one thing here. We got to make a distinction between guys who have been injured and guys who are injured. Like guys coming off major injuries like Achilles, ACL. That's a different beast. I don't draft those guys for the most part. But guys who have just missed games throughout their careers, but still have tons of upside and tons of potential, typically those guys get discounted in your drafts because people are scared to draft them. Don't be scared to draft them. Take the chance on them because the upside is so good. And if they do stay healthy, you're going to get the rewards.
And whether you think it or not, you will fall victim to this. Everybody does. Look, we did too. Players on the Miami Dolphins, one of the highest scoring offenses in the league last year. I remember all last offseason, all the talk was about Tua Tagovailoa. Was he going to be able to stay on the field with all those very scary, very real threats of the concussion possibly being career-ending? People did not want to touch Tua in a draft. And all he wound up doing last year was leading the NFL in passing yards, right? That was a pretty good discount there. One of the better fantasy quarterbacks that you could get basically at the end of your draft. And then the guy who happened to lead the NFL in rushing touchdowns, Raheem Mostert, people didn't even consider taking him until the late rounds because this guy's always hurt. And yeah, he was always hurt until last year. Like, you never know. You cannot predict injuries. Certain guys do tend to get banged up more than others, but you don't know when it's going to happen. So don't be totally scared off of a player. If the value is there and the situation is right, just go ahead and take it. And sometimes it's not injuries that lead to down seasons. Strategy number 3, you might want to consider investing in players who are coming off of down years. There are a lot of different reasons why a guy could have a disappointing season. It doesn't mean you should just ignore them.
Correct. And this is actually what I think is one of the biggest edges in all of fantasy football is looking for players who we know are good players. We've seen them be good. They're still in great situations. And for whatever reason, the year prior, they just didn't have good seasons because there's this thing called regression, kind of like the law of averages, right? We see it all the time where a guy has a record-breaking season. And then what happens the next year? They don't break records. They usually regress more to a normal season. But we also see it the other way, where a guy, for whatever reason, has a down year, and then the next year they bounce up. The 2 guys that stand out to me from last year that come to mind, I'm sure there are more, are Michael Pittman and Mike Evans. Both had a very down years in 2022. 2 guys I really liked in 2022, and they both had very down years in 2022. So what happens going into 2023? They're kind of afterthoughts in drafts, and then they end up being awesome in 2023. They bounce back because they're still good players in good situations. So that's what you want to look for here. You don't want to take somebody who had a down year who's bad or very old or not in a good situation. But if you could find guys who are in good situations still, who are still young enough in the prime of their careers, or maybe guys who are in better situations this year, like Drake London's, Terry McLaurin's, guys like that, but are still young enough, those are guys you want to take the discounts on if they're there because people are like, hey, this guy was so bad last year, I'm not touching him this year, because this is really how a lot of people think.
Yeah, if you play fantasy sports long enough, especially fantasy baseball, regression comes for everyone. And it happens both ways, negative regression and positive regression. This is what you're looking for, and that happens mainly with touchdowns. It's the great equalizer in fantasy football. You can't predict touchdowns very easily. Look, red zone usage is very important to track, but sometimes guys get lucky and sometimes guys get unlucky. You talked about Mike Evans, big red zone monster last year, and meanwhile, Chris Godwin was left out, barely scored, had a down season. What do you think is going to happen this year? It's going to get worse or maybe better, especially with a new offensive coordinator there. I have a feeling Chris Godwin is going to be one of those guys who bounces back in a big way and winds up being a steal in fantasy drafts. Now, strategy number 4, don't just get overwhelmed by the rookies here. What about some second-year players who could break out? It used to be back in the day we looked for third-year breakouts. Well, now it happens even sooner. But just because a guy had a down season as a rookie doesn't mean you should ignore them either.
Right, and this is a very tough one because, right, rookie fever is alive and well right now because the rookies are the shiny new toys. We have all this excitement for all these rookies. They're all going to be great. But really, what really happens, like how many rookies are really actually great in year one? Not a lot of them, and we probably know who most of them are going to be. But yeah, sometimes year 2, even year 3, we saw like a guy, Nico Collins last year, huge year 3 breakout. Those are the guys you really want to target because, again, kind of like what we talked about just in the last one with the guys coming off down years. When players come off down years, people just think, well, he was bad last year, I'm not going to draft him this year. But fantasy football is about looking ahead and trying to project what they're going to do this year, not what they did last year. And a lot of times these second-year wide receivers who didn't do it much as a rookie, or second-year running backs, it doesn't matter. I mean, we saw that with Rachaad White, James Cook last year, 2 second-year running backs that didn't do much as rookies. People didn't really want a piece of them in fantasy, and then they ended up being great. So yeah, second-year discounts, again, another great edge you can get in your fantasy football drafts for people who have given up on these guys after 1 year already.
And this is where the best value lies. Everybody knows the rookies. Everyone's excited to get the rookies. I'm not saying don't take rookies because, yeah, rookies, some of them will pay off. But these guys who didn't shine immediately in their first taste of the pros, those are going to be your great values. That's why I'm all over a guy like Jackson Smith-Njigba. I remember he was the number 1 receiver drafted in his class. Didn't perform like a stud in fantasy, but things are different in Seattle now because new coaching staff, new offensive coordinator, maybe he'll get his chance to shine. Which brings us to strategy number 5. The players get the headlines, but you also have to look at the coaching staff. This makes a huge difference sometimes. So look at some teams that have new head coaches or new offensive coordinators and figure out how that could work to your advantage. So who are you looking at specifically this year?
Well, I'll tell you the team that I think is going to surprise more than any other team offensively is the Carolina Panthers. And for 2 reasons. Number one, because really if they're even decent this year, that's probably going to surprise a lot of people. But mainly because of head coach Dave Canales. I've talked about it on some other videos. This is the guy 2 years ago was a QB coach for the Seattle Seahawks, and he saved Geno Smith's career. Last year, offensive coordinator for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, saved Baker Mayfield's career. I think he can get the most out of Bryce Young. No, maybe Bryce Young will never be as good as CJ Stroud, but I think he's going to be significantly better than he was last year. I think the Panthers are going to be an offense that are going to surprise a lot of people. And then the other offense, if we want to dig really deep, that I think is also going to surprise, especially in the passing game, is the New Orleans Saints. No, I don't think the Saints are going to be an electric passing offense. And you know I'm not the biggest Derek Carr fan, but I love that they brought in offensive coordinator Clint Kubiak. He's going to use play action. He's going to use pre-snap motion. This offense last year was one of the most static, old school offenses. Just everybody line up, stand where you are, snap the ball, and run. They're playing football like it was 40 years ago. He's going to bring a modern twist to this offense. And again, no, they're not going to be one of the best offenses. But if the New Orleans Saints are middle of the pack or top half of the pack in passing, that's going to surprise a lot of people. And outside of Chris Olave, really all their players are going as values. So those are the 2 offenses I think are going to really surprise people this year.
Well, one offense I already mentioned in Seattle finally getting a modern look because Pete Carroll was a great coach for a long time, but it was obvious that the times had caught up with him. This team had been kind of stagnant, and now we're going to see those weapons unleashed. DK Metcalf could be on the way to his best season. Of course, JSN. We see both those running backs in effect. They have an offensive coordinator also coming from the college ranks, so that will be exciting to watch. So I'm looking for that offense to take a big step forward. I think the most pleasant surprise in fantasy football terms will be Tennessee. I mean, talk about a team that was stuck in the 50s. It was basically sit back, hand it off to Derrick Henry, and watch him go for 3 yards in a cloud of dust and hope he breaks one. I mean, that needed to change. Thankfully, it has. New coaching staff. Derrick Henry himself is gone, which, look, he'll be fine in Baltimore, trust me. But Tennessee now actually gets to see what Will Levis can do. Got several receivers there that could be interesting. A pair of running backs that could both be valuable. So I think that they could be a pleasant surprise for a lot of people. And not anybody is really on them in terms of fantasy. A lot of these players could be great values. Look, we're going to be here all draft season to help you win. Those are some strategies we know will work, and we're going to help you with players, who to select, and also who not to select. These are some guys who just might not be relevant this season.